Hello, everybody. Welcome. When we sleep, usually we dream. And here I use the word in its simplest, common, rather clumsy usage, meaning that we experience images, we experience images and situations that have extraordinary forms of meaningfulness associated with them. And it would be truly astonishing if we could have the experience of something like that while awake. And there are some analogs of this in our common experience, and there are simulations of it in our representational modernity. Simulations are things like shows and video games and such. But these are very crude simulations. There are other possibilities, such as the use of psychedelic drugs, which I'm not personally a huge fan of, though I don't mean to denigrate them categorically. Also various forms of play, particularly perhaps role-playing. Our relationships with animals have some of this extra meaning associated with them, and so too with plants and insects and living places. Those I'm a big fan of. If someone said, well, if you don't like psychedelics, what would you suggest? I'd be like, living beings. Non-human beings, living places, animals, plants, insects, all of the kinds of organisms here on Earth, which I understand in my own way as both the extension of my own body and mind, and I am the extension of their body and mind, an extension of their body and mind. Oh, here's a hummingbird doing the diving attack. I don't know if you caught that. It's kind of hard to film. What's the forest doing up so high? Why is Ladybird flying so high? Huh. Might be one of the hawks is here. Yeah, there's the hawk, that's why. Huh, interesting. I know my birds, they don't usually fly way up off the ground. They tend to stay, relatively low to the ground. But there's one of the Cooper's hawks and one of the jay couple, who are my friends and companions. Though I also care about the Cooper's hawks, too. And it's probably Pharos, and that looks like probably the female of the hawk couple. Just a little bigger than the male. Last night, I was on a walk talking with my friend Eric, and I decided to go to the lake at night, and I was hoping to see an owl, or one or more owls. And I was also hoping to see some bats. And I got to the lake and wandered around. Didn't see any owls on the way there. When I got there, I saw, or I didn't see, I heard a great horned owl, male, calling. So I called back, as I often do, both to practice emulating the sounds of animals, and also there's a special kind of game in nature that most creatures are willing to play to various degrees. And it's a complex game. It's a communications game where signals are exchanged. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to get the signal exactly right. Most animals are intelligent enough that if you get close, they'll play with you. And this includes creatures that we might not expect to play this way. For example, jumping spiders. If you do some gestures toward jumping spiders, especially with both fingers at the same time, occasionally, first of all, jumping spiders are interested in human beings, and they're aware that we're intelligent animals and aware of them. They're quite startlingly intelligent, jumping spiders. Much more intelligent than people would ordinarily suspect. And by intelligent, I mean aware and available to both communion, right, just being together, and also communication, to exchanging signals. That's what I mean in this instance of intelligence. So I made a few calls to the hawk, or excuse me, to the owl, emulating its calls, and it flew across to me right over my head and landed on a nearby tree and continued calling. And so I made a few more calls, and it flew even closer and made a few more calls. I've never had that experience with an owl before. I've emulated their calls a few times, but I never had a situation where it became obvious they were paying attention to me. And this was certainly that kind of situation. And that's when things start to become a little bit dreamlike, right? Because my identity has changed. Now I'm interacting with non-human beings. There's introduced into my relatively ordinary moment-to-moment experience, there are these extra dimensions of identity and meaning, which are not easy to name, but they're easy to sense. Right? When our experience becomes kind of what we might think of as magicalized, authentically, right, then we are closer to the dreaming awareness that often arises when we're sleeping. And then I was talking to my friend and saying, I was really hoping to see some bats here this evening. And sometimes I can call them, and I imagine that I call them by imagining them and then loving what the image in my mind of the bat and their beauty and their power as a people, their sensitivities, their intelligence, their history, their lineage, all of these feelings come into my mind when I'm calling to the bats. Oh wow, the coyote girl. The blue jays are sort of noticing the coyote girl and making calls around her. I think it's a girl. I said that because there's a mom coyote here, and this one that just passed, I didn't get a good look at the animal, but it resembles her closely. The one that I see often, she has a fang that sticks up out of her mouth on this side. So it's easy to recognize her if it's the same one, if I see her face. So you see, the introduction of animals into our situation, wild animals, it transforms everything, right? Because in one sense, it awakens the animal aspects of ourselves, the old, really old aspects, far, far older than language or concepts, far older than representational cognition, truly ancient. And this is a kind of dreaming. Now we have this word dream, and we can use it to refer to all kinds of different things and experiences. Even if we use it only to refer to those things that happen while we are sleeping, there are still many, many forms of dream, many different kinds of dream. And it would be helpful if we're going to use language about dreaming, which is kind of like using sand about water, or using deserts about water or something. It would be helpful if we had a more diverse catalog of categories of dream experience so that we could understand that there are a wide range of different forms of dreaming, that most human beings experience some of the elements in the catalog throughout their lives. And maybe there are unusual exceptions, people who can remember all of their dreams most of the time, people who can't remember any dreams, perhaps people who don't dream. There are certainly many people who claim they do not dream. Boy, the Jays are really busy today. I have touched that hawk. It has touched me. Physically. I won't soon forget that. So, there are many forms of dreaming. As an example, there's the kind of dreams that we have, or the scenes we may experience on the way to sleep. Just as we are falling asleep, there are some transformations of consciousness that we're not ordinarily aware of. And then usually, not always, there are very unusual kinds of dreaming scenes that are often quite bizarre and can be somewhat incoherent. I remember one from a long time ago when I was 18 and I fell asleep at my job, which was okay for me to do at the time. And there were these like three-eyed monsters with tentacles wearing sports t-shirts riding 4x4s over this terrain that was very bumpy, and they were jumping and laughing and being crazy. It's not a regular dream, right? It's like some weird scene. And often if we dream if we have a dream that occurs in the place we are actually sleeping, that's often a very special type of dream. If we have a dream where there is problems with some common electronic situation like lights, often a strange dream. If we have a dream in which we see the sun or the stars or the moon, this is a special kind of dream. Often, not always. And there's a plethora of different kinds of unusual dreaming. So the fact that we had a dream, if someone says like I dreamed, that doesn't tell us much yet. I want to know more. about, what kind of dreaming were they experiencing, and also, of course, what can they recall about it. Although it seems very unlikely that our recollections of dreams are accurate. They tend to be skeletal remains of the dreaming experience, where we have a linear stream of events that happened, like a plot. And this is certainly nothing like dreaming. In fact, the relationship of linearity to dreaming is highly questionable. The waking mind probably imposes linearity as it processes the dream and translates it into something that can be held within waking consciousness. Certainly this is not the dream, because if we could truly remember the dream, or even tell the dream, I think we would have to be dreaming at that time. Because again, once we're awake, categories, identities, things, beings, situations, sequences of events, these do not have the same depth of dimensionality, meaningful dimensionality, that they have in dreaming. They have a different kind. That depth that we have in dreaming has been translated into something like structural complexity in waking. And that's a crappy trade. You'd like to have both at hand, both freely available, but if you mostly have just the structured aspect, it's going to be a kind of poverty, right? A kind of emotional and relational and intellectual and cognitive poverty. I know that's a tree, but unless that evokes some feeling in me, it's not very useful to know that that's a tree. If I merely have the experience of categorizing the things around me, that's a this, that's a this, that thing represents an opportunity, that thing represents a threat, in the way that is more or less common to waking consciousness, what we have is a terrifying impoverishment of awareness. Awareness has become a kind of bank manager, right? An accountant. And this is a cruel and tragic way to live. Yet most of us, in much of our waking lives, are in a situation like this, and we're differently in it at different ages throughout our lives. It's interesting that we think of our human existence as one thing. It's impossible for that to be true. It's many things, and they transform over the phases, the life phases, the sort of instars of our humanity, as we walk the path of incarnate beings in linear time. And of course, most of us who have managed to survive long enough to age a bit realize that something about our interior is still very young, regardless, like our interiority, regardless of our physical age. I, at my age, late 50s, still I feel that I am 20-something in my core being. I don't feel 50-something. My body feels 50-something. I've acquired sophistications that are, and nuance to my awareness, thought, speech, and such that are natural to my age. But fundamentally, like when I'm dreaming or something, I don't dream of myself as 50 or 50-ish or whatever my age is. I dream of myself as like, I'm in my 20s somewhere, maybe 30s. And some might conclude from that I'm stuck somehow, but I don't see it that way. Rather, as I've said many times before, I think we are all of our ages, and so in the dreaming, in the generalization that could happen in dreaming, we might be our median age. But of course, some people perhaps dream of themselves as being old. I'm curious about this. I'm curious about the question, when you dream, how old do you seem to yourself upon reflecting on the dream after awakening? I'd love to interview many people and find out about that. But yes, I think we're all of our ages, much like a tree has many rings. The core ring is its first year, supposedly, and so on. So there are lots of kinds of dreaming, and dreaming is in a sense magical because it introduces non-ordinary dimensions of identity, meaning, relational opportunity, and result, effect, and affect, right? Feeling, seeing, which is profoundly natural to the dream, somewhat less natural to our waking experience, though that can vary depending on what's going on. We are capable of having deeply felt visual and sensory experience while we're awake, but for the most part, it seems that many of us don't, and it probably changes throughout our life as we go through life phases, how sensitive we are and how available we are to being affected by what we see. In dreaming, to see is to be affected, right? And I think this is probably more like what I might refer to as our natural state. I've been profoundly fascinated with dreaming ever since I was a child. And I've resisted rather strenuously common ideas and descriptions, explanations, and so on of what dreaming is or what happens when we're dreaming. And there's another kind of dreaming which is to envision, right? To envision, for example, a future toward which we are working and for which we are hoping. This is what I would refer to as visioneering. And I think it's a very important part of our lives and our life paths and our capacity to affect them with our will and our intentions, this visioneering. But it may sometimes become very difficult for us to do, or even seemingly impossible under certain kinds of circumstances. And I've experienced some of these circumstances, as well as having experienced the vital, nourishing profundity of actively visioneering my future and then living into that. I want to make a side note that the people who are selling little methods for this, like The Secret and other shit, I find that stuff reprehensibly confused and simply not trustworthy, right? Not good. Though, again, I think they are commodified repackagings of something that is natural and good and true about our essential humanity, our awareness, our minds. It's natural for us to visioneer our futures. And I think it's healthy to do that. And it's probably unhealthy to be stuck in some situation where we're not doing that or we feel we can't. And that's not an easy problem to solve when that arises. I don't have a prescription for it at the moment. So that's another kind of dreaming, right? Visioneering. And even if we are creative, if we write or dance or make music, especially if we improvise, this is also a kind of dreaming, right? The dreaming faculties become involved with waking consciousness when we are being creative. And that's a wonderful experience that I am profoundly supportive of. Earlier in the day, I was playing with a young raven, emulating its peculiar sounds. They have this musical clacking they can do. They can make all kinds of sounds, and some of them are extremely difficult to emulate. When we were having a good time and the raven was following me around as I was doing my ceremony and my chants, and it was really sweet. It was fun. There are different kinds of lucidity in dreaming, And these produce often astonishing results. I am deeply interested in lucid dreaming and have had some experience with it myself. But what I'm more interested in is sort of the opposite. I want to understand how we might bring the dreaming faculties into our waking experience without our waking experience collapsing into a dream. And lucid dreaming is sort of the opposite. We gently bring certain faculties of the waking mind that are ordinarily what's the right word? We introduce certain faculties of the waking mind that might otherwise ordinarily cause the dream to collapse into waking. But they're introduced gently enough that the delicate manifold of the dreaming experience is sustained. And there are different kinds of lucid dreaming. There are also some things that resemble lucid dreaming but aren't exactly lucid dreaming. And it's my strong suspicion there are profoundly magical aspects of special kinds of dreaming in which we can accomplish tasks or goals in a non-ordinary environment, the non-ordinary environment of dreaming, with non-ordinary activity. There's some chamomile over here. So this is what chamomile looks like. That's stuff we sometimes drink in teas. And as you can see, most of the petals are pointing downward, but in the sunlight they point upward. Yeah, that's some chamomile. These are sunflowers. There's some kale. This could be... yeah, I'm not sure what that is yet. There are specific transformations of the dreaming manifold that result in powers. And it's not really my goal to examine this in detail today. I just want to mention it as a note. I am not particularly inclined to quest for power. Power is not really my primary interest, though I'm not uninterested in it either. I'm more interested in insight, understanding, awareness, than in power. It strikes me that, I was thinking this just before I started making the video, and perhaps I'll wrap this up soon, but it strikes me that dreaming is to the waking mind somewhat like digestion is to eating, right? We eat the food. The digestion process begins with chewing and salivating and things. Enzymes are introduced. But in order to really get the nutrition that the foods can provide, we have to digest the food, and it goes through this long process of digestion. And I actually think that dreaming is deeply associated with digestion as well. And perhaps also what we sometimes refer to in the modern day as the gut brain. There are neurons, there are distributed populations of neurons in our digestive system, and probably also in our heart and in some other organs, but particularly in our digestive system. And it seems blatantly obvious that these neurons are symbiotically linked to what we refer to as our microbiota, the unique ecologies of microorganisms that we each that comprise half of our cells in our human bodies, the non-human half of our cells, without which we wouldn't last a moment. So all of us are half non-human, at least. And I think that's an important thing to remember and pay attention to. So I think dreaming is very important for our health, and anything that affects it is going to affect our health, and certainly our mood, our intellect, our memory, vocabulary, and so on. But I think that it's particularly fundamental to maintaining our memory, and developing our memory, which is the foundation really of our mind, our identity, everything. No memory, you got nothing. Well, you've got moment-to-moment sense and perhaps subconscious response. But even then, without memory, it's hard to imagine being able to make sense of sensory experience at all. And then there's the last thing I'll say. Most of us are pretty concerned about dying. We want to stay alive. And I'm in that camp. I'd like to stay alive. Not forever, but I'm kind of not too excited about the prospect of death either, because it seems fraught with peril to me. Though I may have that backwards. I've certainly gotten things wrong before, even very fundamental things. So it strikes me that dreaming is probably something like training for what happens when we die, presuming that something does happen, or that rather that the manifold of our human awareness is not merely extinguished, but proceeds through some set of adventures or phases of transformation, and so on. It seems fairly clear that awareness is... by the way, I also think it's funny that we tend to speak as if dreaming is all the same thing. It isn't. Being born is all the same thing. It's not. It never was. It can't be. Dying is all the same thing. It can't be. Right? Each of us experienced birth, but the results of birth were very different for each of us, even though they might resemble, in a superficial way, the results of other people's births, right? But each birth is very unique, and each life is very unique, even though it matches up with the superficial categories of this was a birth, that is a life, and so on. And so I think it's funny that traditionally we tend to think of death as the same thing happens to everyone, essentially, right? And I just don't believe it. I mean, the same thing doesn't happen to everyone when we dream, right? Everybody doesn't have the same dream at the same time every night, right? Dreaming's a unique experience every time we encounter it, and so is being alive for a day, even if our way of being in our life has become deadened enough that it just seems like another repetition of you wake up, you do the blah, 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 and you go to sleep. You eat the food, you excrete the waste, you do the chores, you go to sleep. So I think that whatever death might be, it's probably profoundly diverse in terms of what is possible. And I'm relatively concerned about it, because it seems like, at least while I'm embodied, I have the capacity to direct some of my experience and developmental, play and such. Whereas I'm not so sure that's going to happen without a body. Don't know what the transformation is going to be. But I suspect that death is something like training for, that dreaming is something like training for death, which I guess could also be reversed in that death is something like training for being incarnated and dreaming. I'm looking at a yellow swallowtail butterfly. So these were some of the things that I had on my mind After my meditation today, I was thinking a little bit about dreaming and thought I would talk some about it. And one of the most important things about it is that what we see in dreaming, we don't see it in the same way we see things while we're awake. It's a different kind of seeing, and it's much more inclined to have transformations of emotional tone and form resulting from anything that we interact more or less directly with in the dream, but also the context in which the dream is taking place. And so there's this seeing feeling going on, right? We don't merely see things, we feel what we're seeing. And part of that is because in the dream we are seeing the formations of our own awareness. Now, if we could do that, and many people have suggested that we should while awake, we might liberate ourselves from the trap of everyday consciousness, and perhaps even from the sort of self-identity that we cling precariously to in the waking world, and that is radically transformed when we dream, though aspects of it are sustained. And this is one of the reasons why psychedelic drugs are interesting or popular, is because under their influence we often have the experience of feeling sight. We feel what we see. It has associated with it dimensions of meaning, non-ordinary meaning, that are vastly unlike what we usually experience while we're awake, though there are exceptions. Again, in a state of ecstasy while we are awake, we will have feeling seeing. Yeah? And sometimes without ecstasy, we will have feeling seeing. Something may capture our heart, right? And so we have an intense experience of feeling what we see. With psychedelics, it's more generalized, so that almost everything evokes this experience rather than only certain things. But there's something not entirely authentic to much of what I understand about psychedelic experience. There's something, what is the word? Come on, vocabulary. There's something a bit like emulation rather than the actual stuff, right? A bit like counterfeit feeling seeing. The drug causes the feeling seeing instead of it emerging naturally. And this is different from when it emerges naturally. So I'm concerned about that, and I've had experiences that have nothing to do with drugs that radically out astonish anything that's ever happened to me with psychedelics. And those experiences I hold very dear, and would like to have more of, although they can be quite dangerous. Because when we're having those experiences, we no longer belong with the common people who we are surrounded by. And there's various ways of not belonging. And some of those are dangerous, and some of them are vital, and some of them are, virtuous. And there's all kinds of different flavors of non-ordinary experience. So I just wanted to talk a little bit today about dreaming, and some of the things that were on my mind about it. Hopefully you found this in some way enjoyable or enlightening. I always have fun making these videos, and very grateful to those of you who pay attention to them and learn with me. So for today, thank you for joining me. May your waking world experience expand and admit some of the non-ordinary faculties and senses that are natural to our humanity, but inhibited by our common waking circumstance, habit, and situation. All blessings to you. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye for now.